There are edgy comedy pitches, there are really edgy comedy pitches, and then there's Taika Waititi's Jojo Rabbit, which offers an old-timey, mid-60s Disney-style coming-of-age fable about a lonely but precocious 10-year-old boy and his wacky, troublemaking imaginary friend. Set in Germany during the waning days of World War II, where the boy in question is a wide-eyed and naively unquestioning fatherland patriot, and his invisible best pal is a friendly, sprightly incarnation of Adolf Hitler.
I don't think I can do this.
Was? Of course you can.
Aber dann kamst du.
What? If you can get past the shock of the premise itself, and especially if you're familiar with the subversive, deceptively offbeat, but also sneaky, heartfelt comic sensibility that Waititi previously brought to Flight of the Conchords, What We Do in the Shadows, Thor Ragnarok, among others, you can probably guess what the point of such a wildly transgressive swing actually is. Using the child needs to outgrow a fantasy crutch storytelling template as meta-allegory for exploring how mid-20th century Germany, or any civilization really, can fall under and then try to crawl out of the spell of something as absurdly evil as Nazism. To be sure, using comedy to process the Nazis is just about as old as the Nazis themselves, with everyone from cartoons to Charlie Chaplin to the Three Stooges shooting their shot during the war itself to, most famously, Mel Brooks' Springtime for Hitler sequence in The Producers. But where Jojo Rabbit stands out is not simply once more highlighting that on top of everything else wrong with them, Hitler and the Nazis were, well, really silly about their brand of wickedness, all that purposefully evil-looking uniforms.
Hans, are we the baddies?
Goofy repurposed fairy tale mythology and janky Wagnerian iconography, but in highlighting how specifically childish it all was as well. The angry little boy's self-righteousness of Hitler's speechifying personality, the naked juvenilia of the Nazi aesthetic itself, and the deeply uncomfortable but historically correct idea that a lonely little whelp like Jojo, rather than the confidently chiseled Übermenschen of the propaganda posters that he plasters his walls with, is in fact the ideal empty vessel for Nazism to have dumped itself into. By now, the fact that Hitler and the Nazi Party inner circle, being fixated on mythology, obscure occult stuff, classical art, and religious arcana is a lot more well-known than it was in the immediate post-war period, but while facts like Hitler being a middling artist himself and a failed art student have been joke fodder for years,
Hitler, there was a painter. He could paint an entire apartment in one afternoon, 2 coats!
a lot of time the reporting on this tends to take it all at self-aggrandizing face value, presenting the Nazi mythology obsession as being this serious, scholarly, and portentous thing like Hitler and his cohorts wanted it to be. The modern dark fantasy trope of the evil Nazi science wizard achieving real important discovery in the fields of archaeology or mytho-history make for great bad guy plots in movies and comics and whatnot, but in doing so they obscure the fact that much like how the Third Reich was not actually all that efficient, or well-managed, or strategically confident, or even battlefield tough, but were mostly good at looking the part for a while, Hitler and his inner circle were, well, with the tacky aesthetic tastes, the boy versus world paranoia, and shared love of sitting around old castles, making up their own new cults and systems of government based on medieval fantasy and poorly reimagined prehistory, when you get right down to it, they were kind of a bunch of gigantic dorks for the most part. Nerd! In fact, one of the reasons early public profiles of Hitler the politician didn't take him seriously until it was too late is that they recognized his personality as little more than an immature, daydreaming man-child, despite his military record and difficult youth. Many who reported on him at the time amusingly noted that his public speeches were precisely popular because he talked in the simple, one-dimensional language of a juvenile fiction hero about heroes and villains and good and evil in German history related to the rest of the world, and that as an adult his favorite books weren't necessarily grown-up literature, philosophy, even politics or history, though he did read those because he read a lot of books period, but rather German youth adventure fiction aimed at young boys from his childhood, particularly the works of Karl May, a sort of German equivalent to James Fenimore Cooper or H. Rider Haggard, who wrote action-adventure tales for preteen boys that evinced classical old German values of duty and heroic idealism, but set among fantasy versions of American Indian society with names like Winnetou and Old Shatterhand. And of course there's his well-documented love for the music of Wagner, which reinvested Teutonic, Germanic, and Norse mythology with muscular blood and guts grandeur and stark good versus evil thematic simplicity in contrast with the romantic nuance popularized in mythic art and theatrical stagings of the post-Enlightenment era. This in turn carried over to the aesthetic preferences of those he chose to surround himself with in adulthood, leading to a Nazi leadership base that was simply lousy with fellow grown-up angry little boys like Himmler and especially Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, nervous, socially disliked, emotionally immature bookworms with an uncomfortably familiar fixation on mythic power fantasies who railed against deconstructionist and social realist art and ultimately constructed the artistic, architectural, aesthetic, and literary identity of Nazism around a tacky vision of faux Roman neoclassicalism that, despite their claims to the contrary, owed a lot more to the completely fictional visions of the glorious past from juvenile boys' novels and pulp stories than Germany's own actual, supposedly forgotten history they claim to be representing.
Bang! Zoom! Straight to the moon.
That's not an astronaut, it's a TV comedian.
And he was just using space travel as a metaphor for beating his wife.
There's a longer thread here connecting a lot of badly managed historical detective work happening in the early 20th century, trying to connect unsolved pieces of European history to a shared prehistory and theoretical, singular, pre-Christian pagan monofaith that also informed everything from the ancient astronaut theory to the modern-day neo-pagan revival to H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard's Conan stories and a lot of other pulp fiction. But there's only so much time in one show, guys. Suffice to say, the reason that so much of Nazism, from the dopey "of course we're the bad guys" costuming to the loud "now" for the dumb kids all the way in the back, completely ahistorical, made up, not based on anything real at all, lost Aryan master race mythology.
No. Blonde hair, blue eyes, super strength. I should be recruiting them.
Sounds like corny bullshit that fits so well into comic books and cheesy adventure fiction, because those are the places, plus, his own ass, where Adolf Hitler pretty much pulled most of it out of. In which case, it's not that surprising that the Nazis were popular among youth gang troublemakers before they caught on as a political front, and why one of the first things they did when they were in power was set up their own evil version of the Boy Scouts, which is of course the realm in which Jojo Rabbit largely takes place.
There you boys will be involved in such activities as war games, ambush techniques, and blowing stuff up.
The fictionalized and heavily speculative, but thematically on point for the most part, 2002 drama Max featured John Cusack as a fictional Jewish art dealer who befriends, or at least makes the awkward acquaintance of, Noah Taylor as a young Hitler who hasn't yet given up on art in favor of politics. Though soon recognizing that the boy is clearly a sociopath and very possibly a dangerous one, Cusack's character also believes that Hitler's sketchbook of fantasy architecture and reimagined mythological concepts, which the audience of course is able to recognize as the blueprints for Nazism itself, is evidence that the danger could be averted if he could convince Adolf to work out his dark fantasies through art instead of the political arena, though circumstances obviously prevent him from doing so, and the rest is actual history.
That's certainly an alternative to boring old modernism. My God, you really worked this out, didn't you?
Down to the uniforms and...
Yes, I see. He's resurrected all the German gods, and it's all complete kitsch from A to Z. It's very interesting. It's future kitsch.
Oh, he sounds mad.
Oh, he's barking! And what he's pushing makes the Kaiser seem like a Sunday painter. I saw him speak.
Oh, really? That sounds a bit of a worry.
No, he's dreadful. He just stands there shouting slogans and posing.
Which is a bit of a reach as Hitler origin stories go, but it makes for a compelling what-if drama, and also features a scene of the Fuhrer to be getting way too into a puppet show for a person his age.
The Aryan was led into temptation by soft, swarthy people from bountiful lands.
Which ends up feeling like one of the more plausibly true-to-life renderings of what this guy actually was like, and also maybe a disconcerting answer to the question of, I wonder what the 1930s version of guys who get way too angry when proper respect isn't paid to the rebooting of cartoons they liked when they were 5 was. This kind of, think about it, won't you, approach to the, again, yes, very uncomfortable to actually sit and think about parallel between Hitler and his cult of fanatical persecution complex as authoritarian political machine buddies and the worst aspects of so-called fandom culture and modernity is also the operating premise of Norman Spinrad's 1972 novel The Iron Dream, a dark satirical literary art piece combining a bad-on-purpose imaginary novel with bookends in the form of an alt-historical contextual introduction/author bio at the front and a selection of scholarly criticism on the supposed reconsideration of the imaginary novel serving as the coda. The fake novel at the center of the piece is a generic, badly written, again purposefully so, overwrought and cliche-riddled post-apocalyptic heroic fantasy, utterly indistinguishable from the 1,000 other lone hero of the savage future sword and sorcery tales choking the sci-fi fantasy genre at any given point, following a righteous hero who returns from war to find the remnants of human civilization, buckling under the oppressions of mutants and subhuman creatures, maintaining brutal order by forcing humanity to forget and deny the culture and identity of the mighty pre-apocalyptic past, and instead embrace the debased and impure new order that allows the mutants and subhumans to thrive instead. To restore humanity to greatness, the hero rallies his allies under the banner of an ancient symbol and builds an army dedicated to restoring glory to the human race's past achievements, ultimately triumphing and reclaiming a world by and for those it had belonged to before and wiping out the scourge of mutants and other inhuman villains. Once again, the point is that this could be describing any of 1,000 shitty good guys who remind you of you versus bad guys who are not you disposable fantasy action novels of the time. But the joke in The Iron Dream is that this particular otherwise disposable pablum is supposedly a Hugo Award-winning novel called Lord of the Swastika.
Come again.
And we've already been informed that it was written in 1953 by a semi-obscure but once mildly prolific Austrian illustrator, pulp sci-fi novelist, and fanzine editor who emigrated to the United States in 1919 shortly after the end of World War I, named Adolf Hitler. And you thought the Starship Troopers movie was a too-on-the-nose way of pointing out that the golden age of this genre could get really problematic sometimes. As you might expect, The Iron Dream is a pretty bizarre piece of work. If Hitler wrote a crappy sci-fi novel starring his own thinly disguised self-insert character, Ferric Jagger, winning a racial purity future war instead of starting a real one, the book would be laughably bad because Hitler had shitty juvenile taste in literature and was a madman is kind of a minor punchline to write an actual entire fake bad book to justify and then give away said punchline up front. But Spinrad's real stinger turns out to be the coda, in which an imaginary literary critic pens an essay on the renewed popularity of Lord of the Swastika with then present-day genre aficionados a few years after the alt-universe Hitler's death, which has come to include dedicated fanboys cosplaying the signature black, silver, and red uniforms worn by the good guys of the book, holding rallies, parties, and marches at sci-fi conventions mimicking the ones Jagger holds in the novel, and even suggesting that the violent defensive homeland militarism and true man purity nationalistic ideology preached in the context of the book is actually quite applicable to how one could and perhaps they do view and interact with the politics of the real world. Activities which some observers of the sci-fi community have begun to consider, a little bit worrying for some reason.
They've got skulls on them. Have you noticed that our caps have actually got little pictures of skulls on them?
Of course, the essay ends up dismissing such concerns as a little overblown. After all, despite Mr. Hitler's vivid imagination, late-night bonfire rallies, big speeches, and symbolic appeals to masculist mythology probably aren't enough to galvanize an entire society, right? And if chintzy rhetoric being play-acted by the Lord of the Swastika fanboys in their sharp little black costumes does bear some discomforting resemblance to the nascent fascist philosophies that briefly cropped up in the mid-20th century but never really caught on, well, so what? After all, what's the worst that ever came from a bunch of alienated weirdos getting together to geek out over shared love of problematic juvenilia that they never grew out of? I'm Bob, and that's the big picture.